Well, Energy Media readers, welcome to another interview. And today we're going to be talking to Stewart Prest, who's a professor of political science at Fraser University. We're going to be chatting about the recent appointments to key cabinet posts in the Trudeau government, in the federal government. So welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, I'm going to set a little bit of context because many of my readers will have read my the column I wrote the day after the election, in which I argued that we now seem to have, at the federal level, a climate plan that will help the country meet its targets of being consistent with Paris Agreement targets for 2030, net zero emissions by 2050, and all roads to those targets go through Alberta. Alberta, the oil sands alone are 10 or 11% of national emissions. Alberta is 36% of national emissions with only 11.5% of the population. So with that context, with that background, Stewart, we have two new ministers in environment and natural resources. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a background on Seamus O'Regan and Jonathan Wilkinson.
So we have here a couple of ministers who they're not coming from an environmental background. They're not sort of former activists or formally engaged in those issue areas. So we have Andrew Wilkinson here in Vancouver and or North Vancouver, and so he has a background in industry. He has a background in left of center politics. He cut his teeth in Saskatchewan under the Romano government, I believe, and so he has worked in related industries from a sort of executive perspective, but he's not someone who sort of brings any kind of bona fides in terms of working with environmental causes foremost in mind. At least that's not what we know about him publicly, and so that is. Certainly, it's a turn from where Catherine McKenna was, and she was, I mean, an ardent worker in the cause of environmentalism, and took a lot of flack for that over the last 4 years.
Right.
So that's the one, and then the other, Seamus O'Regan, coming from the other side of the country, a natural resources minister now, and so his background, I don't know as much about him and his previous life in politics, but likewise, he's not coming from anything like an environmental movement. And my overall sense looking at this cabinet was that it is designed with, technically calling it triangulation in mind. So the cabinet doesn't have, it's impossible to have somebody, an MP from Alberta, Saskatchewan. So we're kicking around these ideas, should they have a senator, something like that, but we haven't gone that route. Instead, what we seem to have is a number of people around the table in important areas that have links to Alberta and Saskatchewan. So it's a bridge building cabinet trying to triangulate these two prairie provinces. So you have Wilkinson is his ties to Saskatchewan. You have Chrystia Freeland in this new ministry, and so she's got ties to Alberta. So that seems like it's part of the plan, trying to make links to Alberta, not necessarily push forward on the environment.
And the Prime Minister made another appointment, which I thought was kind of interesting. He took his Winnipeg MP, Jim Carr, who was his first natural resources minister, and made him kind of an emissary to Alberta and Saskatchewan, which is quite interesting. And I think Carr has been fairly well respected. I mean, when I've interviewed him, I found him to be very pragmatic, and he's kind of plugged into the energy transition and all of that. So I thought that was a good move. And then, of course, we have the Prime Minister has been leading on Anne McClellan, a former Liberal cabinet minister out of Edmonton, who would bring the Alberta perspective to that as well. So I guess that backs up your bridge building argument.
Mm-hmm. I think it seems like that's the overall theme. And I guess Seamus's link, perhaps through the links of the oil patch, and we have the connection between workers going from the East Coast to Alberta, and energy industry is big for both Newfoundland and Alberta. So there's another link as well.
So with all of that context now, what do we say about these two new cabinet ministers as the inevitable conflict ramps up between Ottawa and Alberta over climate policy? That seems to be, I don't know these two ministers well enough to get a good handle on how they might react. What's your take?
I don't know that it's possible to say until we see them in action, but this government is effectively in an impossible position. So there, to a certain extent, it doesn't really matter who you put into those places. They're still trying to square this impossible circle where you have talk of alienation around the West, I mean the Midwest, right? It's from the interior of BC over to about Winnipeg, and you have at the same time increasing concerns among urban Canadians about the pace of change to respond to the threats of changing climate. And so those are pulling in diametrically opposed positions. We've talked more about Western alienation because of the results of the election, but that larger debate is still there, and was kind of hidden during this election, where we were talking about all this kind of like small ball politics, right? Talk about politics, about affordability and issues like that. But in the background, we have this major debate about what is the future direction of this country and what is the country's economy going to look like. And we never really got into it.
I want to run a little bit of a hypothesis past you to see what you think of it. I don't think the Western Canada, or the Midwest, as you call it, is as alienated as we think. I think certainly the Conservative leaders, Jason Kenney in Alberta and Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, have whipped it up for their own partisan interests. And I think there's been a lot of exaggeration. We see that around the Trans Mountain expansion. You know, the Kenney and the Conservative industry leaders in Calgary are constantly, you know, on this notion that the government is killing pipelines and is doing all these, you know, horrible things to kill the industry. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister, you know, the government basically bought a pipeline company and a new pipeline for the industry, and is now under considerable criticism in BC, and he's building it. So I really don't buy that down on the street, Albertans, Saskatchewans, some of British Columbians and Manitobans are as alienated as we are being led to believe. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, it depends what to some extent we're debating labels here, because so I grew up in rural Alberta. So my first 20 odd years were there. And so there's, it may be better to talk about it as polarization, perhaps, or just political identity. Effectively, it's not clear what the Liberal government could do for many voters in Alberta to make the voters in Alberta like them. They just don't like the Liberals. They haven't liked the Liberals since the NEP. It's you can call it an article of faith. You can call it a piece of identity. Voting is often about identity. How do you want to represent yourself to the world? And so there's a conservative identity that's really taken root in Alberta, and increasingly we see it in Saskatchewan as well. So what we end up with is this different kind of conversation, different kind of identity there. And I think that has been magnified. Partly it's the politicians are playing a role, but it's also partly this alternative media landscape that we see created. So effectively what we end up with is two separate conversations. The country's conversations, we used to have sort of broad central media that everybody got their information from, and we don't have that as much anymore. We have isolated conversations. We sort of have an urban metro conversation. We have a rural conversation, and in that has outlets like the Rebel feeding into it, and the sort of the post media chain. It feeds into those kinds of conversations, and they just a fundamentally different view of what's important in the world, and so you don't end up with a shared conversation. So it's not. Again, it's not clear how the Liberals can break it down. The divide, I wouldn't say it is not real, but its sources are complex.
Given that that's the case, and most of our readership is in Alberta, even though I live in BC, and we're plugged into Alberta politics. We do a lot of our reporting and analysis about Alberta energy issues. And if I agree with you on all of your points, but if Prime Minister Trudeau is sitting in his office in Ottawa and shares your point of view or our point of view on this, you can see why he might shrug his shoulders and say, okay, fine. Well, what can I do about it? I mean, if I can't resolve this polarization, then I've got other things I have to do. I'm running a country here. I can't be appeasing Alberta and Saskatchewan all the time. Do you think that's a likely approach that he might take?
I mean, it's at a certain point, if the Liberals are serious about their climate policy, they don't have much choice. All this talk about building bridges to the Midwest, as I'm going to continue to call it, is going to be about trying to find ways to get them on board with this plan. And there's lots of things we could talk about. We can talk about retraining. We can talk about so off ramps for industry, for workers in the field. The oil patch is the had this huge investment over the years, but it does depend on continued support from government of a variety of kinds. And so we start sort of transitioning that. That's all going to happen at some point if Canada is going to come remotely close to meeting its Paris targets or the new commitments of this government. And so we're just going to have to find ways to bring that part of the country along. And maybe we're going to have a bigger debate next election on that larger direction for the country.
Now, I've been a critic of the industry over the last couple of years because they've taken a hard turn to right-wing politics. And I say that, it's not my opinion. I've interviewed a number of executives, former executives in Calgary, and they talk in terms of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, for instance, having gone from being a policy shop to a partisan politics shop. Yeah. So the industry, which has always been a bastion of conservative values, has really been politicized, in my opinion, over the last 2 or 3 years. In fact, I would go so far as to say that after the 5 oil sands CEOs came out in support of Rachel Notley's climate leadership plan in 2015, for the next 2 years, there was almost a civil war between the oil sands, the progressive camp in the industry, and the camp that currently, the conservative camp. And the conservative camp won. I don't think there's any doubt about that. At least that's the story my sources tell me. Right. So given all of that and how, dug in these industry is and Kenny is, how in the world do we ever come up with compromises or move forward and get beyond that polarity?
It's a good question. And when you have industry advocacy groups, so taking your sources at their word for the moment, that taking sides in a political debate, that in itself is unusual. That's not what we expect advocacy groups to do. Your goal is to move policy, so you're going to want to make sure that whoever's in power, you have their ear. And so you don't. Most advocacy groups, most industry groups don't take sides. They look for ways to influence whoever's in government. So this change of strategy means that they may end up on the losing side of a political debate, and they currently are, nationally speaking. 1 in 3 Canadians, roughly, are okay with a party that doesn't really have a strong commitment to action on the environment. The other 2/3 of Canadians are voting for parties that do have firm commitments, and it doesn't seem like that's likely to change. That is where the country is, and if anything, I would expect that portion to grow. So at a certain point, it's not a question of, the country is reaching out to these parties and these provinces, but at a certain point, they have to understand that they may lose a debate if they're taking a side.
Now, speaking of losing a debate, Abacus Data has done some very, very interesting opinion polling over the years on climate change and pipelines in oil and gas. And one of the sets of data that they have tracked since 2013 is who lines up in favor of pipelines and oil development, who is neutral about it, and who is strongly in favor. And so the data shows that those who are strongly opposed are about 20%, and that 20% never changes. It doesn't go up, it doesn't go down. That there are just 20% of Canadians who are never going to like oil and gas. Now, in 2013, there were 58% solidly in support. And over the last 4 or 5 or 6 years, that support has bled from the supporters into the neutral camp. And now I think it's 44%. So they lost 14, 15, 16%. People who just, okay, fine, I don't care anymore, or I'm fine with the energy transition and getting off fossil fuels, that sort of thing. From my point of view, when we talk about winning, that's the key battleground. Is the industry is just slowly bleeding public support across the country, and eventually, because that Justin Trudeau and his advisors are looking at very similar numbers, at some point the government could say, well, I guess if you're going to lose, you may, if we're going to have a fight, this is a good fight to have because we're winning, we're getting this more support, they're losing. What's your take?
I think we're seeing that calculation, and nationally we can see that the conservative coalition of voters that used to top out at around 40%, but it's not we haven't seen them get to that point in a couple of elections now. And so if the new conservative threshold is more like 35%, if they've lost, say, 5% of the vote, it just gives the conservatives much less room to maneuver. And I'm watching, as much as we want to watch the Liberals, I continue to watch the Conservative Party here, because they're going to have that version of that debate too. And we've seen little bits and pieces of it online already, where the face of the Conservative Party, Jason Kenney and the sort of Ford ideology, but you also have other conservatives who are saying we need to reach out to urban Canadians, so folks like Lisa Raitt, and so that means things like marching in pride parades, and it also means things like taking climate change and climate action more seriously. And so that conversation is going to happen in the Conservative Party as well. If they say they didn't, I believe it's somewhere 60, 65 of the most densely populated ridings in the country, they're just shut out of all of those. You can't win a government if you're shut out of all the densely populated parts of the country. And so the Conservatives are going to have this conversation as well. If you become a voice of a regional set of interests, and that region is a minority of the country, that's not a winning calculus more often than not. So I'm going to watch the Liberals, but I'm also going to watch the Conservatives. They have to have that discussion.
So let's get back to the cabinet ministers just to wrap up our interview, Stewart. So my take on those two individuals, Seamus O'Regan and Jonathan Wilkinson, is they strike me as being more pragmatic. They strike me as being folks who can maybe broker deals, who can maybe bring Alberta and Saskatchewan, if not on board, at least more on board than they were in the past. Would that be a fair take?
It's a good guess, but I really want to wait and see here, because the Liberals have played their cards, as we've talked about. They have to meet these commitments, and so putting new faces in place may be a step forward, in having someone who doesn't attract the kind of criticism that as McKenna did. And I think quite a lot of it was unfair, misogynist, and so on. And so taking that out of the mix may help things here. We're going to have a temperature turned down a little bit. And there's a sort of short-term calculus where Conservatives and Mr. Kenney and Mr. Moe are going to want to be seen to be in opposition to the Liberals. That's good politics from a provincial standpoint, but from a national standpoint, there is going to be at least some basis to try to move that Conservative Party forward. And if so, then having these new ministers in place who don't have the last 4 years of battle scars, that might make some new space for deals to be made down the line. But we're just really going to have to wait and see. I think it's too early to make bold predictions along that line. It's a fractured political landscape.
Stewart, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to our next chat about Canadian politics.
Sounds good. My pleasure.